Okay, I hope you can see, there we go, all of this stuff up here. Well, thank you very much. I know today is a little bit of a tricky day to get out in this weather, so you're hardy souls, we're Laramiettes, this is what we do. So thanks for coming. I know that this is a big thing to get away for during the day, and I'm really honored to be able to be here again today, and thank you for having me back. I really also want to thank Uniwyo. Uniwyo is our credit union here at the University of Wyoming and in Laramie, and I don't know, 1953. Something like that. 9 guys that worked, or maybe some gals too, who worked at the University of Wyoming, pitched in $5 each and said, let's start a credit union. And so however, 66 years later, 65 years later, almost 66 years later, here we are, a thriving community partner and somebody that I personally am a member of as well. I think they do great work, and they really enhance our community's pride, I think. So let's give Uniwyo a big thank you too. Woo. They're pretty great. I had a credit union I will not name in another town asked me to do something similar a few months ago. And it was the weirdest event because they just moved into town, and they're like, it was strange. There was a magician. I followed a magician. I'm like, what? Seriously? Okay, sure. So I like these guys because it's got the hometown feel to it, and they know us better than anybody would from outside. So thank you, Uniwyo, and thank you all. Without further ado, I will welcome you to the 114th month of our economic expansion since the Great Recession. If this thing lives for another 6 months, I believe it is, it will be the longest expansion in modern history, economically speaking. So it's been around for a long time. Recession or expansions don't die of old age. So there's that. That's a good thing. But it's been a pretty giantly long one. So let's just kind of go down the road here, look at what the situation report is for the global US and Wyoming economies, and kind of walk through where the signs are headed as far as our economic situation goes. So as far as the national and global economies, if you have been anywhere near water in your life, you might recognize that flag. That's a, watch out, there might be a shark around here kind of flag, or a rogue wave, or one of those kinds of things. Because we are still looking pretty good when you look at the headline numbers. Our national unemployment rate is the lowest it's been in a long time. GDP growth has been really strong. But recession risks have been emerging. And so if you listen to some of the talking heads in late 2018, which seems so long ago, they talked about the fact that there was likely to be an emerging recession set of risks in the latter part of this year. Some of that calculus got a little bit changed by the shutdown. So we'll talk about that too. If you look at the headline numbers though, our labor force participation rate has recovered nicely. It is probably at a lower level than it was before the recession, and will continue to be at a lower level, at least for a little while, mostly because the baby boomers are in the midst of finishing up their retirement boom there. And in addition, there's the increased participation. I'm sorry, you can't see that with the little zoom thing at the bottom. That says increased participation of millennials in the gig economy. So the gig economy is just like if you're a musician, you do gigs. Millennials and some other people as well do gigs instead of taking long-time employment. A lot of employers are interested in this as well. You do a project, you do a thing for them for a short period of time. You don't necessarily get benefits, but you get paid on a sort of piecemeal basis. The gig economy has been growing over the past several years. And so when you're in the gig economy, sometimes you're considered temporarily laid off, sometimes you're considered employed. So that labor force participation rate will start to bounce around a little bit because of that. Headline number for unemployment rate, pretty great. It did uptick to 4% in January because the federal workers that were on leave, enforced leave, were considered in temporary layoff status. There are 2 surveys. I've talked to you guys about this before. There are 2 surveys that do unemployment. One is employer survey, one is a person survey. And the person survey is where the unemployment rate comes from. And this one showed that temporary layoff status of our federal workforce impacting our unemployment rate. Payrolls were up in January as well, 304,000. The estimate had been about somewhere in the 150 range, so this was a strong number. It caused a lot of people to feel a little bit more optimistic in the stock market, so the stock market went from being wacky to being less wacky. And then finally, the other headline number I always like to highlight to you guys is the percentage of the workforce that wants to work full-time but can't find full-time work. Some of those are temporary layoffs from the federal workforce. Some of this is people who want to work full-time but only have part-time employment. So there are a number of different kinds of folks that are captured in that. That has come back down from the Great Recession in our 114-month extravaganza of expansion to a normal level. Although it ticked up a little bit, as I pointed out, in January because of the federal shutdown. But there are several downside risks, and that's fancy econo speak for bad stuff, okay? Downside risk, anybody ever says downside risk? Upside risk means good stuff. Downside risk means bad stuff. So there are several bad stuff things that we need to be watching because they're either here and may provide a headwind to our progress economically, or they're on the horizon. So here's one interesting piece of data that came out not too long ago from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that shows that the recovery of jobs and creation of jobs has really, really diverged in the United States between rural areas and urban areas. So this is another, there's a lot of polarization out there for a number of reasons. This is part of why, right? The recovery hit very strongly in urban areas, that's the upper blue line, and less strongly in rural areas. So that's a caution right there. The recovery is not even geographically, and the recovery is not even when it comes to income strata. So one big thing that had probably accelerated our recession risk is the federal shutdown, the partial federal shutdown that was the longest one in history, 35 days. It was a long time, it was a very long time. And that probably accelerated our recession risk because, well, it increased unemployment, for one thing. It also causes psychologically, even those people who are going to work and not getting paid, but we know they're going to get paid anyway, they still psychologically become a lot more cautious with their spending, and that causes some issues down the road. You can kind of break down the effect of the federal shutdown into 3 categories. One is the direct impact. So there are a number of different places that threw out some numbers that I thought were interesting to share. KPMG estimated that every week of shutdown cost the GDP of the United States of America $1 billion. So that was in the midst of the shutdown that they came out with that estimate. The Congressional Budget Office came out with their estimate after the shutdown, and they estimated that in Q3, the direct impact on GDP of people not getting paychecks from the federal government was $3 billion. And in January, because that's where most of it went, that's where most of it was concentrated, $11 billion. Now, some of those folks are going to get back pay, and so their spending will re-up, right? But we will still see, by the CBO estimates, a net reduction in GDP of $3 billion because of the 35-day federal partial shutdown. So that's something to keep in mind. And for us here in Wyoming, 2.5% roughly of our workforce in Wyoming works for the federal government, and that's not even including all the people that work near things because of the federal government, like the national parks. The indirect impacts of that federal shutdown were pretty substantial and could have been much, much worse if it would have dragged on, because things like food stamps and school lunches and federal research grants and things like that would start to go bye-bye. So the federal funding for those things were mostly front-loaded into the first part of the year. So this didn't happen, but if they shut down again and they can't come to an agreement, this will happen. This will start to exponentially impact the GDP impact of the shutdown. So because it impacts our investments in physical, human, and intellectual capacity for the country. And then finally, this was my favorite right here. Well, they're all pretty bad, but lack of data. Y'all think that data just comes out of no, you guys don't think that. You know that there are people that do this and they mostly work in the federal government. The only data that was available from the federal government during this period of time was job data, and not all job data either, just job data. What was missing? Well, let's see. Trade, manufacturing sales, retail sales, commodity forecasts. If you're a rancher, you might want to know that. Construction starts, everything else was missing. So we were essentially operating in a fog for 35 days. People make decisions. Companies make decisions about expansion, hiring plans. We make decisions about our portfolios, but we didn't have the data to make those decisions. 35 days of fog with no radar, right? There was no instrumentation available whatsoever to make good decisions financially. So that was another, as an economist, an affront to me personally. Another headwind that we're facing, trade wars. Of course, there are numerous discussions right now with China, some of our allies like Canada and Mexico and the EU about trade relationships. And unfortunately, when we make a policy about trade, we tend to get retaliated against. And that is kind of the biggest problem with trade wars as far as I'm concerned. It's compounding. We have a rising dollar. In other words, the value of the dollar overseas has gone up. It's more expensive to buy American stuff. And so that combined with retaliation against us in putting taxes on our goods abroad, which is what retaliation is in this context, means that everything that we try to sell abroad is actually a lot more expensive, and therefore we're also hurting our domestic producers. If you look at some of the graphs and indicators out there, these are just a few that I got from the Economist Intelligence Unit, which I love that phrase. People always like, well, that's an oxymoron. But the Economist Intelligence Unit actually just had a webinar this morning about this very issue. What are the impacts of rising tariffs? And just to kind of give you a sense of where tariffs globally have been and where they're going, the number of tariff increases here, it starts in 2009, so that's over here, and it goes up to 2018. And you can see that they went up pretty startlingly there, and the scale is really quite large. So what that does is it adds to the uncertainty. So we fly without federal data for a while, but we also have a lot of trade uncertainty, and trade uncertainty also impacts businesses, our businesses, domestic businesses, because they're trying to make contracts with supply chain forward and backward. They're trying to figure out where they're going to get various inputs, how they're going to get various things abroad. And when trade uncertainty rises, that becomes a lot more difficult. I used to work for Colin Powell when he was the Secretary of State, and he used to say, capital is a coward because it hates uncertainty. And he was right, right? Here's another, this was one of their case studies as to sort of the impact domestically of trade wars. And this is the one I wanted to highlight. This says, inflation is difficult to avoid when you're in the middle of a trade war. Because when you increase tariffs, you increase prices, right? You increase prices of everything. And that hits the lowest income folks the highest. This is the percentage of their income that they spend on, of household income that they spend on things that are coming from abroad. And you can see that for the upper, this is highest and then next and so on down the line. For most people, it's less than 1% impact on our income. But for the poorest folks in the country, it's 1.6% of their income going to just trying to keep up with inflation due to tariffs. So that's something to keep in mind too. And then one other thing that they showed was a case study. Now they pointed out, this guy that was giving this webinar is great, he's Irish. So I was just like, just talk. I don't care what you say. Just talk. I like Irish accents. So Tyre is spelled T-Y-R-E. They mean T-I-R-E, of course, to us, right? So they used a case study for, they pointed out that President Trump did not invent tariff increases, right? This was under President Obama. But in 2009, the United States increased tariffs on Chinese tires. And the idea was because they were dumping their tires here. They were selling them here under cost, right? And that was hurting our domestic manufacturers. And what ended up happening was that we saved or increased jobs by about 1,000 in the tire manufacturing sector in the United States. But everybody that needed to buy a new tire and didn't have a lot of money had to put off buying tires, or they bought the tires and then they spent less on everything else. So it impacted domestic consumers, and it didn't actually help our domestic producers very much because our tires tend to get exported to other countries. So it was kind of a wash. So this was an example that they gave. I thought it was a good one. The impact of tax cuts, this one may seem like, why are you putting that into the bad category? I'm not putting it in the bad category. I'm just putting it into the watch out for this category, okay? The tax cuts that came into effect last year had an estimated impact of 1% of our GDP. That means that it increased our income 1%. That's pretty great. But this was a sort of a one-time in, and it's going to peter out this year, according to every estimate out there, including those done by the executive and the Congress. So it will peter out thereafter. So that little goose to economic growth is probably going to go down. Unfortunately, that will mean we will have to pay for all of those tax reductions that we are enjoying. There's no question we're enjoying those. But it is going to increase our debt as a percentage of our GDP. And it's going to increase how much we have to pay in interest because we are borrowing to make up the difference because we actually are spending more than we were before as a federal government. And so what that means, and I hope you can see this, it's not that easy, but it says here, this just shows the net effect of that, and it compares us to other countries. So our government debt interest as a share of our revenue is estimated to go up to 8.1%. That means that all of our tax monies that we pay, income, corporate, all of those, 8.1% of those will have to go to paying back the money that we borrowed to keep spending at the rate we had been before. And we're higher than everybody else. So, except for what? Oh, Italy. Well, of course, Italy, right? Italy always proves, yeah, they're in trouble with the EU because of that, right? We're not in trouble with anybody right now. So that has led to an annual deficit estimate for going forward starting this year of $1 trillion. That's a lot. Something to keep in mind. This one, I don't even have I don't have graphs or anything on this. I just put up these words and I go, oh my gosh. Brexit, of course. Brexit is, but like nobody wants to go to Ireland right now because of Brexit. They're worried about everything falling apart on them. Venezuela, Brexit, which is the EU and Britain, right? Britain exiting the EU. And that has not been, like, their exit plan has not been resolved. So that's putting some uncertainty into everyday life there and globally. Venezuela is having a little internal dispute that, one guy says he's president, the other guy says he's president. We're weighing in on one side, the Europeans, most everybody's weighing in on one side over here. But Venezuela is a large oil supplier to the United States, and so that's having some impacts. China, as I think I've said this every year for 7 years now, just keep up the trend. China's China. We just never know what's going on. They are actually in the midst of a bit of a decline in their GDP growth. Now, their declines in GDP growth are still ridiculously large GDP growth from our perspective, but for them, they're going from 8% growth to something like 5% growth. So that's something to watch out for. That also means that our export profile to China is going to start changing significantly because they're growing in their income. And the end of global synchronized growth. We've had 114 months or so of expansion, everybody in the whole world, and now China's kind of doing this thing, and Brexit's kind of causing this other thing, and so the synchronized growth period is pretty much over. Another source of risk right now is the bond market. This may or may not be interesting to you, but it can have impacts on your portfolio. So we had this really long period of low interest rates, and it's not like they're really high now or anything, but they were so super low for so long that it was cheap for firms to borrow. So a lot of corporate bonds were issued during the 114-month expansion. And that means that the longer that goes, the more less good risk bond stuff goes out there. So more companies that really shouldn't actually be borrowing are starting to borrow. Their revenues aren't where they should be in order for them to be good risks for you. And so corporate bond risk is starting to rise as well. Oh, just nothing but, I'm just like not happy today, I'm sorry. It's the weather's beautiful, I love the weather. I am a happy person, generally speaking, but then I give this and I'm like, sorry. Healthcare is another headwind to watch out for, particularly when it comes to when we look at different quartiles of income levels, all right? If you look at the average person, we're still at about 17% of our expenditures going to healthcare, and that can go up exponentially really, really quickly, but this is the average person. And that has a really giant impact when you look at, if you break it down by income level again. Folks, this is the highest income level over here and the lowest income level over here. So the blue is healthcare spending. So obviously, the wealthier you are, the more you probably spend on healthcare. But as a percentage of your income, that's what this orange line is. And you can see that for your average lowest 20% income level person, they are spending almost 60% of their income on healthcare. So, and that can be a problem if they have a significant health problem. It's a problem on an everyday basis though too. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And then, as if I didn't depress you enough already, let me talk about the robots that are all coming to take us away. No, actually, so the robot revolution is an interesting thing. AI and augmented reality and whatever else they call these things nowadays, digital learning and all of, or sorry, what is it called? Something learning. Machine learning, there we go. I'm like, there's gotta be an engineer in here who knows the right word. Engineers know this stuff. All of us here, if we work at the University of Wyoming or in any sort of educational setting whatsoever, accountants and surgeons and manufacturing workers can lose their job to robots, right? Because they can do stuff routine and fast. That's where we need to think as a community about how we are going to help educate people to have jobs that may not exist yet, and not for jobs that are definitely not going to exist soon, right? So these are just some different kinds of robots. They're not all little Roombas. Some of them are humanoid, right? So in the financial services sector, if you're ever certainly not with you in a while, but maybe you have a chatbot, I don't know. Nope, okay. Some places have a chatbot, and that chatbot is answering your questions. Capital One, for example, some of the credit cards do that. It's a humanoid. It may not look like a humanoid, but it acts like a humanoid. You think it's a person. Stationary robots, these are kinds of the manufacturing robots that we're already familiar with. There's aerial and underwater. These are kind of the unmanned vehicle category. They can do a lot of surveillance that normally people would have done. non-humanoid land robots. This is Roomba, but it's also the little guys that go out and run stuff that people who used to work on gas lines just 2 years ago do. They check for leaks, they fix them, things like that. So this is another thing that actually has a lot of promise, I think, because when have humans ever liked doing routine things, the same thing over and over and over and over and over? That's what the Industrial Revolution brought us, which was great. But these guys can do all that stuff. What can we do that's more fun and interesting? That's what I look at this as. But it's also something that scares the bejeebus out of some people. So if you look at Wyoming, let's zoom in on Wyoming now. Let's go where our little road has led us through the nation's capital, through the heartland, and now we're in Wyoming. So let's see what's going on in Wyoming. Wyoming, of course, had a pretty rough time for the past few years. And it introduced a lot of volatility into our state revenues, which here in this town and a few other towns around the state, that has a really big impact. But it also had a big impact on employment in a lot of places like Gillette and so on. So the good news is that the unemployment rate is way down here at a really decent level, right? 4%, much lower than it was before. But employment, total number of people who have jobs, has reduced significantly. So that's, you know, the last peak was here. We're not going to talk about that peak. That's too long ago. That peak versus that one. So that's 25,000 people. For us, that's a lot of people. And that also shows in the labor force number. This is the number of people who are looking for or have jobs. And that also has fallen. So there were 310,000 people who were in the labor force at the peak of the last boom. 300,000 of them actually had a job. Now there are 286,000 people who are looking for jobs or have a job, and 275,000 of them have a job. So, and that partially is, of course, because we had a reduction in the number of people that live here. A lot of people that had come in to work in gas fields and so on have now moved. A bunch of graphs, and they're all scary. Watch. Okay. Tax revenue. Sorry. I don't have a picture of Hutch. Oh, no. I'll have to figure out. I'll send one out to everybody. How about that? My dog, my cute little adorable dog. All right. So the change in tax revenue. So this is from the Pew research site, Pew Charitable Trust research site. They do a lot of, they've just released a bunch of reports about the states, the state of the states. And so this is pulled from some of their work. And this shows you the changes in tax revenue from each state's peak quarter. So the blue line is a national average, that's a 50-state total, and the orange line is Wyoming. And so you can see that our tax revenues, here's 0 right there. So right up here is 0. So anything below that means tax revenues go down. So you can see they were pretty low, went up there during the peak, down, went up, went out, and then went really far down. Okay, I'm depressing you, I'm sorry. You've all stopped eating. All the food moving has stopped, and that scares me because you're all like, oh my God, I want you to drive home happy. So I'll figure out how to do that. All right, the year-over-year 1% or change. Okay, let me just back up on that for just 3 seconds. This is showing you our severance tax, our property tax, and our sales tax revenues as they moved around. So it's a volatility score. So it's showing the change from year to year from 1998, which wasn't a fabulous year for us here in Wyoming, all the way through to 2017. And these areas here are recessions that are labeled that way. So you can see the severance tax is the purpley pinky one, the property tax is this blue one, and sales tax is the dark navy-ish color. So you can see severance is, of course, highly volatile because that's dependent on the value of the resources being extracted, whether it's coal or gas or trona or bentonite or any of those things. So it's the most volatile, but you can also see property taxes are very volatile because most of our property tax revenue at the state level comes from The mining sector, woohoo! All right, so when they go down, the severance tax goes down and property taxes also go down. Sales and use taxes also in some parts of the state are used, are also earned mostly from mining. So, and extraction. So that's also kind of volatile, but not as volatile as the other two. So you can see there's a lot of volatility, but it's not like it just happened last year that suddenly we were volatile. We've been a volatile tax-based state for a long time. We all know that. This is just an income estimate here, adjusted for inflation from 2007 to 2017, and you can see there's a recession. 2009 was a recession for the whole country, and that also followed here. So there's the reduction there. Here was where the boom stopped for us, and then you can see we went way down there in the peak of the bust, and now we're kind of recovering. So the darker purple is the United States average, and the lighter purple is Wyoming. So you can see we've followed the national trend during times of economic expansion and recession, but it's been magnified by our dependence on severance taxes. Annual population growth, you can also see the out-migration of people from Wyoming right there in 2016 and 17, whereas US population growth rates across the 50 states has been positive and fairly stable across that period of time at 6.9%. Ours is higher, but that's because we had a lot of people come in for a little while, and then it just kind of tanked, right? So early on in that series, the tall, dark green ones, that's us, and you can see our population growth rate was quite high, and then it's gone negative. So days, this one I found really fascinating, so I thought I'd share it with you because I think this is interesting. Days each state could run on only rainy day funds. So this tells you how many days you could operate your state's government with just your rainy day fund. So in our case, that's the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund and a couple of the other coffee cans that we have around. So here you can see the US average is like 3 days, which that's not necessarily great either. And here you can see it kind of really ramps up there during the Jonah boom, and then it kind of levels out, and then it kind of goes woohoo way up there. So we are at 375 days that we could run the state government on the rainy day fund. So interesting. Another interesting one, if you didn't just look at the rainy day funds, but you looked at all the revenues that Wyoming has, you can see the percentage of expenses that are covered by our taxes. So this right here is all of it, right, 100%. So this line right here, it's a little hard to see, but this line right there, below it's orange and above it's white. Below it, you're not covering your expenditures with your revenues. Below it you, or above it you are. And you can see Wyoming, of course, because of the rainy day fund and the investment funds that we have, it tends to be up here. So there's another interesting piece right there. Okay, but look, there's good news. There's really good news. Okay, because of Venezuela, I cannot tell you what is going on as far as natural gas and oil and all of those things. Brent went up, Brent went down. That's the fancy way of saying oil prices for a barrel of oil went up and then went down. It's very volatile right now because of Venezuela. But I will say that I think things are probably evening out, okay? And the biggest political risk, both internally in Wyoming and in the federal government, is ourselves. It's not Brexit, it's not other people, it's us. So that's just to keep that in mind. I think Wyoming Endow and Engage is the young folks group. Endow is, of course, the large scale project that's been going on for the past couple of years to plan for diversification of Wyoming's economy. I think that actually has a lot of legs. I think the new governor is very devoted to it as well as the old governor was. And I think that as long as we keep the eyes on the prize, that will probably bear fruit, but it's not a short-term project, right? You don't just diversify overnight. There are some good and honest conversations that are going on in some of our energy dependent communities about how to transition to their future on their terms as they wish to. And I think you would have had a hard time having that conversation a few years ago. I think they're a little bit more open to it now, but it's an ongoing project. We are expanding our trade relationships as a state. We have an office in Taiwan now, but I think most importantly, people are actually paying attention to international trade relationships at the state level now, and that's an important thing for us to do. Of course, Endow, as well as the Business Council, are always, and locally as well, Laramie Downtown is a big partner in trying to help continue to expand our existing businesses. I don't know how many of you go to Big Hollow, but wow, that's nice. Guess what that was? A partnership between Downtown Laramie, the Wyoming Business Council, and a private partner, right? So those kinds of things are happening in pockets around the state, and I think that's a source of happiness. So I do think that people are realizing the need to transition, and we're starting that way. So now, you cannot control what the governor does, and you can't control what the president of the Congress does. But what can you control? You can control your own life, right? Let's be stoics today. Let's go into the stoicism phase and be philosophers for a little while. The thing that you can control is how you feel about things and how you react to things and how you plan for things, just like Seneca said, right? So I'm going to scare you, and then I'm going to make things happier again. Financial experts suggest that you should have between 8 and 11 times your retirement assets in place when you retire in order to replace about 85% of your pre-retirement income. And that is a reasonable estimate, as it says here, I think at least, because you don't have to pay college debt for your students anymore. You probably have paid off most of your mortgage and so on. So that's a reasonable target. If you look nationally at the savings gap that most people have, though, it's quite substantial and a little bit frightening. And part of this is, of course, because the way that we save for retirement has changed significantly over the generation since the baby boomers, right? It used to be a kind of a partnership and there was a pension. Now you're kind of on your own, although your employer will contribute, right? But it's up to you to do the savings and the allocation of that savings. So right now, the national median retirement savings in 401ks average is $15,000 for people nearing retirement. If you take into account all of their assets, it's about $120,000. So if they made $10 a year, they're good. Everything's fine. But I'm guessing they did not, right? I'm guessing they made maybe not that much more, but a little bit more than that. If you look at Wyoming, and you use kind of back of the envelope, I did an analysis for a legislative task force recently on retirement security. So this is, you gotta remember, economists are really good at very, very educated guessing, right? So this is guessing. Not all of you will have this number, but if you look at our median income, that means that Wyomingites should have saved between $440,000 and $605,000 by the time they reach age 65. But if you look at the average Wyomingite, the estimated gap between what they should have saved and what they have actually saved, here's the good news: Wyomingites save more than the national average. But they still have a retirement gap, funding gap of between $300,000 and $350,000 per person, total, not annually. That's good. And the other kind of frightening thing is that about 48% of Wyomingites don't have a retirement savings account at all. So that didn't actually cheer you up at all, did it? Sorry. All right, where am I going with this? But the good news is, I'm just going to riff off what Uniwyo is always telling you to do. feed your piggy bank, right? And you all, you're here. So that's why you probably do this as best you can. But there have been a number of studies that have come out in the past year or so that say savings, we don't need studies to tell us savings are important and good and something you should do, retirement to anything else, right? Emergency, all of the different things you might save for. But the best way to save and the fastest way to save is to not even notice money that goes into your checking account. Setting up an automatic withdrawal from your account, which is what most of us do, I think, with our 401ks, but do that more. And if it's not in your checking account and it goes over to a savings account that's hard to get to or that you maybe even forget about every once in a while, that's a good way to build up savings. Money you don't think about is money saved, right? Money you don't think about is money saved. So, you know why I always says feed your piggy bank? This is actually really sound financial advice. And lastly, do not respond to volatility. The pace of change in this world is insane, right? We can't, but just don't. Don't respond to volatility. Don't respond to tweets. Don't, like any of that stuff. Just go, what do I have control over? I have control over that, right? I have control over how I respond to situations and circumstances. So don't respond to, oh my gosh, everything, they're selling everything off in the stock market. I should, okay, here's multiple choice quiz. I'm a professor, I should do this. Multiple choice quiz. When the stock market goes down, you should call your broker and A, say sell, or B, get off the phone with your broker. B, C is something else. Whole buy is good too. Yeah, because what? Buy low, sell high, not the other way around, which is what people do when they react in a panic. When the stock market starts going into bear territory and they call up and they're like, sell all my, no, no, don't do that. Buy if you can. The closer you are to retirement, the harder it is to do this, right? To think this way, but you should not be in the stock market if you are retired. Or you shouldn't be as much in the stock market as I am, right? So don't respond to volatility. Respond to things that you actually have control over, which is you and your family, right? Your neighborhood, your community. Those things you can help and do something about. So those are my only wise words, frankly. Sorry, I just made this very sad. So that says thank you. I wish I had a picture of my dog, but he's pretty darn adorable. I'm sure you've all seen him. His name is Hutch, and he's cute.